And welcome to the Always Better Than Yesterday interview sessions with me, Ryan Hartley. And today I'm joined by Gareth Davies. Gareth, welcome, my friend.
Hi, thanks very much for having me, Ryan.
Amazing. So please give yourself a little introduction. Tell us a bit about yourself and a bit about your story.
So I co-founded a consultancy called the Bravest Path. We are a courage building consultancy. So we work with with organisations and clients to help their people take more smart risks. My background, I used to be in the Met Police. I worked in various specialist units, and I was a sergeant with them, and then transferred to Surrey Police for a while before making the move out of the job and starting my own consultancy in partnership with my wife.
That's amazing. That's amazing. You and I both share that policing career. And what sort of things did you have to go through? What experiences have shaped who you've become today?
So it's an interesting question, and I know we'll get on to kind of the bits and pieces I'm up to around podcasting and things later, but it's a question that I've been discussing with a few people I've been interviewing recently around what you bring into the job. And so I think what initially shaped me, and I think it shapes everyone, is all those messages that you pick up from a very, very early age. So with regards to what shaped me, I think I was very, very susceptible to, and I really swallowed a lot of the messages when I was growing up from the media, from TV, from film, and to an extent, those people around me, my parents, around this necessity to be strong, always come across as strong, in charge, powerful. And I think that was a big driver, even though when I joined the police, if you'd have asked me why I'm joining, I would have probably given you that stock answer of, I want to make a difference. But if anyone had challenged that and dug much deeper, I'm not sure I knew really what that meant. I just knew it was a good answer to say to people. And having done the work on myself that I've now done, I think the true answer is policing stood out to me as a way of living my adult life and coming across as strong, powerful, in charge. So I think with regards to the challenges that I've faced to get to this point, I think the biggest challenge has been to let go of what I fear other people might think of me. I think as a younger man, I was very much governed by that. And at no point did anyone ever really verbalise any expectations of me. And I'm really sorry, Ryan.
All good.
I'm really sorry. Can you edit?
It's fine. We'll roll with it.
Cool. Okay. I'll just chuck it out.
The joys of podcasting during these times, right?
But I tell my guests, make sure your phones are off and everything's on.
I will take full responsibility for not saying that at the start then.
Okay, so sorry, getting back to that. Yes, so I was very much influenced by what I thought people were going to think of me. And nobody ever told me any of those expectations. No one ever explicitly said, we expect you to be perfect. But that was part of the story I told myself, made up from all the little interpretations I took from the messages coming from all those places we get influenced by. Like I said, back when I was young, it was just TV, really. But yeah, from your parents, from your friends, from your teachers, all those messages, and I just translated it into the world needs me to show up as strong.
And you were a former sergeant and responsible for others and leadership. And the thing I've really come to terms with leadership is that it comes with a lot of sacrifice. And I just wonder, what are some of the sacrifices that you've had to make as part of your leadership and showing up within the police?
Well, I think conversely, I sacrificed a lot of who I really was in an effort to try and show up as who I thought I needed to be. And when I look back at those pivotal moments when I was really called upon to be a good leader, I think, again, it's easy with hindsight, isn't it? But I think I sometimes will have hidden more of myself to try and come across as the leader that I thought was required. And actually, potentially, if I'd learned to practice vulnerability appropriately earlier, a little bit more authenticity would have probably lent itself to a better result than actually what I achieved at the time.
What changed?
Good question. So, with regards to circumstances, I began to struggle with regards to myself, with regards to how I was able to show up. I started distancing myself, isolating myself. I sort of withdrew from life a little bit. I didn't know it at the time, but I subsequently know it was PTSD. But that change came subtly. It came over a period of time. Weirdly, well, not weirdly, but my career didn't suffer. In fact, it continued in a sort of upward trajectory, and things were looking pretty good there. But in my personal life, my wife and I, our relationship became quite difficult, largely because of that disconnection. And we separated for a time because it had grown so much. And all the time, I'm still trying to show up as strong. So I'm putting on the mask. I'm playing that role that I think people need to see of me. So I'm not asking for help. I'm not talking about how I feel. I'm just trying to show up as the perfect officer, the perfect person. But at the end of the day, I ran out of places to hide and excuses to make. And I found myself very unhappy, despite the facts of what was happening in my career. It wasn't fulfilling me. I think I'd wanted to grow up and try and be James Bond, and I kind of thought, oh, you know what, I'm on my way, And when you look at it almost sounds silly to say now, but got to drive a fast car, got to have a gun. It was, I'm ticking those boxes. And the more and more I got closer and closer to trying to get to that unachievable goal, the less fulfilled I felt. And my wife and I took a holiday to discuss our how things were going to be, like what did the future hold. And she, Beth, handed me Daring Greatly by Brene Brown, and I opened it up. First page, there's the Man in the Arena speech by Theodore Roosevelt, and I just sat there, and it just spoke to me, pretty much like nothing had spoken to me before, and it summarized how I felt my life was. That wanting to step into the arena. But for me, I didn't have the courage to, because I was letting what other people's opinion of me might be govern how I showed up. And actually, it wasn't really showing up. It was retreating. So that changed it all, really. That was the catalyst. Sat down, had some very difficult conversations. It was the first point I think I was really willing to accept that even the slightest bit of these circumstances might actually be down to me. So a lot of talking, a lot of reflection. I was in my 30s, and it was the first time I ever really sat down and I worked with a coach and looked at what my values were. Subsequently, coming into this line of work, a lot of my clients, one of the first places I will start with my clients is their values. And you ask someone those questions: what do you stand for? What are your core values? And I think most people are surprised at that question. And very few people have a quick, genuine answer. Sometimes we will panic and go to the ones that sound good: generosity, integrity. But when we really look inside ourselves, I don't think that's something we as a population do very naturally or very easily. And we need to be provoked into doing that sometimes, I think.
So when you went looking intentionally, what did you find?
I found a much softer, happier person away from the uniform. So it's a theme, I think, that goes through the emergency services, that when we put that uniform on, it's a source of immense pride. It's a huge identity. It's a huge part of who we are. But it also comes loaded with expectation. The body armor comes with metaphorical armor as well. That need, and having spoken to a lot of colleagues since, it's that you go into work, you put the uniform on like your armor. At the end of the shift, you take the uniform off, but you're carrying everything else that you experienced that day back to your home life.
We'll come back to your Brene Brown work shortly, but let's just touch on the podcast that you've recently set up, and you're giving a voice to current and former service people up and down the country. You're giving them a voice. What are some of the things that are coming out, and what are you learning about what it means to be on the front lines at the moment?
I think there is a universal misconception by many of our colleagues, no matter what role you are performing on the front line, that there is this expectation to appear strong. I'm finding from the feedback we're getting from listeners that, and it was the turning point for me, I guess, realizing I wasn't alone in what I was going through. I think, again, that is a general rule across the board. So many people have written in saying, do you know what, I just needed to hear somebody else verbalize what I'm going through. So I'm learning that, it doesn't really matter what your job title, it's that expectation of strength. It's the I've also been, and I know this might sound a little bit controversial, but I am becoming less and less comfortable with the increase in references to superheroes. Our heroes on the front line doing a superhuman job. Of course they are. They're doing an amazing job. But if you keep telling someone they're a superhero, there will be some people, if not a lot of them, who feel they have to live into the image that you are verbalizing. And whilst I think it's incredibly well meant, I don't think it's healthy, and I don't think it's supportive. I think it's actually an accidental way of loading increased pressure onto those on the front line. If you keep calling someone a hero, they'll eventually believe they have to be that hero. And heroes don't show weakness. They don't ask for help. They don't tell you, do you know what, I just don't know the answer to that question. And they never say no. And this is something right. The book you recommended to me, Curse of the Strong, and I can't remember the author, but there's a part in it where he comments on how those most susceptible to PTSD are generally the character that is attracted to emergency services, the people who will always be willing to take on an extra role, who, if something gets tough, don't say, do you know what, no, it's not for me. They will always say yes. They will always step into the fray. And he makes the point that actually it is healthy for you to be able to say no sometimes. So that's what I'm learning. I'm learning that it doesn't matter what color uniform it is. The main pressures are very much across the board. Yeah.
Talk to us a little about the podcast. What's it called, and what sort of content are you sharing on there?
So it's called Behind Blue Lines, and it's I interview members from across the emergency services, and I mean, and they are those who have suffered the emotional cost of trauma. That may be PTSD, it may be depression, it may be another form of mental health issue. They are people who have as a result of trauma, suffered disconnection in their personal lives. So I think it's really important to call out that whilst we've got hundreds of thousands of individuals out there on the front line, almost all of them have at least one person back home who doesn't wear the uniform, who might not work in the emergency services, who are the people who are welcoming them home every day. They're the people who have to live with them. They're the people who love them. And as much as it's important to get the message across to those in uniform, you're not alone. You can ask for help. And that's where we want to get them to the point. I also want to make it very clear that they are not the only sufferers of trauma. To give you an example, one of my first interviews was a police officer who was involved in a very high-speed collision. Yes, he suffered immense trauma, as did his wife when she receives the phone call to say, he's in a bad way, you need to get to the hospital right now. That is a traumatic event. And I think sometimes it gets forgotten that I've just come off an interview with a paramedic, and he put it really well. It's like the brick being dropped into the pond and the ripple effect. When that traumatic incident happens, it's not just those people in the immediate vicinity that get affected.
Yeah, you're right. I in my time in the police was trained to be a post-incident manager, a PIM. And if you were a firearms officer, you'll be all well aware of the whole PIM suites. And I was fortunate, it's a funny word, but to spend time with the firearms officer that shot and killed John Charles Jimenez, and to hear the impact on him, his welfare, his life, his family, as a result of, simply carrying out his duties, the scrutiny that he was put through, it can't go unnoticed, or just the amount of stress and pressure and burden that, that police officers up and down the country carry, just simply by being asked to do their best with the job role that they've been given.
Yeah, I think it's a huge burden. I think personally, I probably didn't appreciate that as a young man, eager to experience all those Hollywood moments I assumed the job would bring. And I don't think you often stop and think about it. And I think you give a really good example there of an officer who, I've never met him, but from what I understand of his life following that incident, has gone through tremendous turmoil in his career and personal life. But that's not really made clear to many people until it actually happens.
Yeah, and there's a whole backdrop story there of leadership, which I won't even go into. But talk to me about, you used the word courage. What gave you the courage to leave the police force?
I found the courage to leave the police force when I found the tools and got the understanding of what it is to practice vulnerability. So linking it back to Brene's research, vulnerability is our greatest measure of courage, not weakness. And funnily enough, it was, I've worked on a couple of units which were extremely almost stereotypical, let's say, very, very male dominated, a need to overtly show up as a strong character. And the deeper I got into that world, the more I felt I had to hide those bits of myself that might be portrayed as anything other than this alpha male I'm trying to come across as. And it was exhausting, and it was difficult, and it was confusing, and it didn't make me happy at all, to the point where I never really felt like I fully fitted in. Once I learned actually what vulnerability is, with boundaries and practiced appropriately. Once I worked out whose opinion counts, who I can trust, who I can speak to openly and vulnerably, and not have to try and hide all those things, the less about me I tried to keep in the dark. Conversely, the more confident I felt, the stronger I felt, the more audacious I felt So the less I'm trying to hide, the more willing willing to let that light come into me and show people who I really am, the less I feel like anyone can attack me, the less vulnerable I actually feel. And certainly the more I'm able to influence and encourage those around me. So certainly once I understood what vulnerability was, that was the point when I certainly was the best leader I've been. But also it was the point where I felt I had the courage to do what was in line with my values and not what I thought others expected of me.
Yeah. What led you to then becoming accredited and qualified in Brene's research?
I had initially written to her and her sister, so her sister's director of her organisation, and I'd initially written saying, "Look, your research is amazing. My wife has trained in it. I get it. We need this in the UK." And that conversation developed, and I found myself out in Houston with her team, studying her research. Again, I think the reason why I went out there, the reason why I made that quite big decision, was because it resonated with who I was, because I had a strong understanding then of what are my values, what do I believe in. Well, actually, that is what I believe in. So this is the path I'm going to follow, because this is me. This is not a path that I'm following because I worry about what somebody else's judgment might be. And so it was authenticity, I think, is the answer, the short answer. I ended up studying Brene's research because it was the most authentic research and content for me to throw myself into.
I love that. How do you now take all of those experiences, both life experiences, police experiences, your education? How do you bottle all that up and help people?
So actually, my background, I think, well, you'll know that the world of coaching is saturated with coaches, and when I try and when I think, so what sets me apart? What do I bring that's different? I think back to my time in the police. I went through various, additional training, advanced training, and interview techniques. That curiosity to really get to, let's cut the crap. Get through the lies that either you're telling someone else or even yourself, and get down to what's really going on here. I think it's a natural trait of a police officer to get very curious, but also get curious in quite a direct way. So I have, I'm fortunate enough to have quite a wide client base. But my clients will generally report that one of the reasons why they work with me is because of the personality I bring to my coaching. Because of my experience and because of the way I've had to be in the police, I find it very easy to retain that position as a professional sounding board, never to leap in and try and fix or collude or offer an opinion, to really hold people to account with their own, with what they're saying, and be very direct in my approach. I know, when you're looking for a coach, you need to find someone who fits with you. I think there is a sliding scale of support and accountability, and I certainly put myself much further down that sliding scale towards the accountability. And I'm not saying there's any point on that scale that's better or worse. I think it just needs to fit with the person looking for support and what they need. But I've certainly found my niche is clients who need a very strong, direct, challenging perspective from their coach.
What are some of your values that you bring to life?
So my core values are enthusiasm and playfulness, consideration and family. So I know they are my four core values. And this is the beauty of getting really in touch with your values. They're like a blueprint. So now I have that confidence that I didn't have before. I can then align any decision I have to make, any big decision, right? Where does it align with my values? Does it align with my values? Because if it doesn't, there's a quick answer there. No, out the way, let's get on. And it's a quite an efficient way, particularly when you run your own business and you're trying to, bring your family up, and time is a commodity that is quite short often. And so having a tight grasp on your values is a very good way of working out what you say yes to and what you say no to.
That's really, really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. And I think I've always tried to lead any team that I've been part of with a sense of fun. And just hearing you say playfulness, I just wonder how you incorporate that in your leadership.
That's a very good question, because I've never consciously tried to plan it or consciously bring it into the way I show up. So I know that there are times when I am working and I catch myself being playful, sometimes being cheeky. And it's those moments where I know I am really bringing my best self to that work. It's a really good question, just because I've never planned. I don't plan how to bring my values in.
It's who you are.
It's who I am. So if I'm not living into my values, and that's quite easy to understand once you practice and once you get into it, and you understand that the physical connection with your values. When you're out of alignment, it feels wrong in some way. Then you can either change it up or step out of that situation. But I don't form an intention to try and plan to bring my values into it. It is part of me. Yeah.
I found that as well when I started showing up as the leader of who I was. Things like even just having a 5-minute break to play noughts and crosses, or asking my colleagues will laugh at this. My former colleagues will laugh, because I'd ask questions to get to know them in a sense of, if you were a biscuit, what type of biscuit would you be? And that's the sense of fun in the leadership. It's in the micro moments, in the small moments where we're just going to have a lighthearted moment and we're going to get a deeper connection and relationship to each other.
Yeah. And you've nailed it. Connection. That's what I think that's where the great work is done, when you have a genuine, authentic connection with the person across from you.
Yeah, absolutely. My ethos is about helping people be always better than yesterday. I'm just curious to know what that phrase means to you.
It brings up a lot of different thoughts for me, actually, and different emotions. So I am cautious of the word always. And that is because I get pulled up quite often for using that. You always do this. This is always the case. And that is and for me, that is my perfectionist coming through. The black and white world. Nobody always does something. So that's my perfectionist, and that is me blaming. When I'm using that sort of language, I know I'm in a place of blaming rather than discussing. So, but that's nothing to do with anything other than my own personal baggage with the word always. But I think constant striving, that's what it brings up for me. Always better than yesterday is constant striving. It's interesting. It'll be down for the individual person to define what better is. And I quite like the way it's phrased, because it is, I don't know whether it's deliberately provocative, but what is better? And I think it challenges that, probably the old ideas of I've got to be more than yesterday. And that's that could play out as an unhealthy belief, whereas always better than yesterday is a positive intent and defined entirely by the person using it. So yeah, I like it. And for me, it's self-growth, self-improvement.
Yeah, and those are the core tenets of it: self-growth, always continually learning, and being brave enough to show up and learn more about ourselves, others, in the situation. I do love what you say about it's whatever baggage people bring, because sometimes people want to be practical. Well, how can I be always better than yesterday? And I think, sometimes actually what I try and bring is a sense that if we're showing up and we're doing our best and we have days where we fail, well, we can still be better than we were yesterday, because we've learned something, because we've, the critic in the arena has showed up. They've learned something about themselves, something about others, something that didn't work. So it's just this background mindset that just says there's always something today that I can take forward and do something with today. What haven't I asked you?
Question. I see, this is my perfectionist coming. There's my mind going, tell him to ask you a really great question. I think, what would I like to, okay, so let me ask myself a different question. What would I like to tell you about myself? Because that's essentially what we're trying to get to, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I would like to tell you a little bit more around perfectionism, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like you to be curious a little bit more around perfectionism and brave conversations, difficult conversations. And the reason I'm keen to talk about that is because I've just thought to myself, well, what are the most common topics? What is the repetitive request we get? And from our clients, it is work on perfectionism, and it's work on how to have difficult conversations.
It's interesting, because I think when you talked about having that label of being a superhero for police officers, what I went to in my mind was some of the language we can use as parents with our children, which always puts them on a pedestal, being a superstar. My son's just been labeled Star of the Week this week, and and I think sometimes that can put them on a pedestal and create feelings within them around having to maintain and sustain, the similar ways that you talked about the superhero. Where does your perfectionism come from?
Oh, yeah, well, childhood. And I'm not qualified to say this, but my belief is that for a lot of us, perfectionism is born out in childhood. That's where the seed is planted. We have over the last sort of 12 months been producing a program specifically for 16 to 18-year-olds to help alleviate their struggles with perfectionism. And we've been speaking to teachers, and there are teachers with kids as young as 5 who are saying we are noticing perfectionist tendency in these young children. The amount, I think every school we've spoken to has given examples of they know their students are doing their homework. It's not perfect, so they will redo their homework and redo their homework. And teachers pick up on it because they're saying, I'm getting stuff and there's never anything to mark. I can't give direction because this has clearly been done 5 times until it's perfect. I think perfectionism is one of the biggest threats to our young people's self-worth, their mental health. Sorry, did you ask me what perfectionism is to me? I can't remember the question.
No, yeah, that's all good. This is good.
So, it is one of the most it's one of the most difficult topics. It's one of my favorite topics because I think to a greater or lesser extent we are all affected by our perfectionism. It's something that I don't think you'll ever get rid of, but I think you can prepare for it. It's very much like the gremlin, your inner critic. Like you never get rid of your inner critic, that undermining self-talk, but you can prepare for it so you don't get driven by it. And I think that's the same for perfectionism. It's a response to shame. If you go back to Brene's research, that's what it is. When we go to a place of shame, when we don't feel like we in ourselves are good enough, then one of the behaviors that we would exhibit is perfectionism.
Some people that I've spoken to will describe perfectionism like a double-edged sword. Like there's an element of it that's positive and it helps them be who they are and show up and reach the standards. Is it a double-edged sword or is it just a sword?
So ironically, I want to give you a really decisive black and white answer, which the perfectionist's favourite place to go. I don't think it's a double-edged sword at all. I don't think there's any, or I don't get any benefit from trying to find the positives in perfectionism, because from the usual benefits I hear cited about perfectionism, well, they're all available to people who practice healthy striving. Yeah. People who practice healthy striving have more available to them. So perfectionism is not, if you let go of perfectionism, that's not letting go of high standards. Perfectionists set themselves unattainable targets. And the perverse thing about perfectionism is when you fail to hit that target, which you will, you tell yourself, I'll try harder next time. I'll do better next time. And you never give yourself a break and you never reach the targets set for yourself. The only difference between healthy striving and perfectionism comes down to who are you doing this for? If you know your values, if you're doing it for you, then you're practicing healthy striving. If you're doing it because you worry about what other people will think of you, that's perfectionism.
Yeah.
Perfectionism.
And you touched on... Sorry, Karen.
Sorry, go on.
As I say, you touched on, I can't remember what it was now, but the sense of perfectionism, failure, and actually there are two ways I think that failure can manifest itself in terms of its attribution. So the biases in our attribution. Some will internalize that and blame themselves, and others will externalize that and blame others for the failure. And I just want to link that to what you want to talk about in terms of brave conversations and how can we keep people accountable when they're busy blaming themselves or busy blaming others.
So I think it's important to call out now that blame, it has nothing to do with accountability. So we blame, or blame is simply a discharge of discomfort and pain. No link to accountability whatsoever. And so with regards to having difficult conversations, that key to how do you maintain accountability? How do you challenge? How do you set healthy boundaries and hold people to account in a way that actually builds a relationship rather than breaks it? That for me is the key. And I think that's, it's one of the most important tools I think a leader can have. Setting healthy boundaries, but actually not just a leader. So we do, it's perfectionism and difficult conversations or brave conversations are our two most requested workshops. And they're not always simply for leaders. They're for every level of the organization, because it's about empowering people to say no sometimes, to set boundaries, to say what is okay and what isn't okay with regards to behavior or workload. That doesn't just have to fall on the shoulders of leaders. I think you can empower everyone to have those skills. But it's very, very, a lot of people find it very difficult because, again, it comes back to vulnerability, because to hold someone accountable, you have to be vulnerable. It's about sharing how something makes you feel. And people don't like that. The greatest myth of vulnerability is its weakness. We're taught from an early age, put the armor on, build the wall, don't show weakness. But that is ultimately the key. It's about owning the stories we're making up about a situation. It's about being open about the way that the stories we make up make us feel. And then it's about asking for what we need. And the more explicit we are in the way we ask for what we need, the easier it is for the other person to give us what we need. And I think too often we know what we want, we don't know how to verbalize it. Then when the other person doesn't give it to us, we go into blame. They should have done this. Why aren't they doing that? Did you ask for it in the first place? And do you know how to ask for it? So, yeah, I think the value of being able to have a difficult conversation is huge within an organisation.
I love that. And I think I'm trying to remember this rightly. The foreword to Daring Greatly, Brene thanks her husband, Steve, for making her a better person. And I really loved that feedback that she'd given her husband. And that says a lot about a relationship, doesn't it? And how, because it can be quite difficult to, you'll probably know this as a coach, when there's a sense of emotion involved in a relationship. How can people have more meaningful conversations, not just with those that they lead, but maybe those within their own home, where the emotion can become a blinder to having some of these vulnerable conversations?
So I think a key there is trust. I think when you're dealing with something like emotions, and this also links back to vulnerability, and vulnerability mustn't be oversharing, it's vulnerability with boundaries. So when you're having these difficult conversations, when you're practicing this vulnerability, it must be boundaried. So there must be trust in the relationship. But I can't think of a single difficult a difficult conversation that starts with certainty at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about having your own. It's about knowing why that conversation is meaningful to you. Why is it worth having that conversation? I know, we can sometimes use emotion maybe as a fear or as an excuse not to have that conversation. Like, how often do you not have a conversation because you think, well, I don't want to rock the boat, I don't want to offend. There's a whole list of fears and excuses we use not to have these conversations. A lack of certainty often makes us feel out of control as well. And a lot of people don't like feeling out of control, so that's another blocker. And so I think even in those sort of highly charged relationships where there is a lot of emotion, when you're very close to someone, they still need to be had. They still might come across as very difficult and very raw. But if you can't share your feelings, practice vulnerability safety with the person you're choosing to be with, then perhaps there's some other questions to ask around how you go forward.
On a Facebook group community that I'm part of, someone asked a group of leaders, how can you practice and demonstrate vulnerability more, or something to that effect? And my response was, go first and honor it when you see it in others. What would you add to that list? If there's a listener right now that is wanting to demonstrate more courage and vulnerability, where would they start?
I would start by identifying who in your life, whose opinion counts. Because this is not about wildly running out there and just opening up to everybody and claiming you're suddenly being vulnerable. Work out in your life whose opinion counts, who's earned the right to hear your truth. That's where I would start reaching out to my own, for me, when I was in the police, everybody's opinion affected what I did. So it stopped me from doing anything sometimes because of my constant consideration of what 1, 2, 3, 100 people might think of me. So as a starting point for me, it was when I realized whose opinion really counts in my life. And I understood why those people make it on that list. Who are those? Who are they? Who really knows me in a way that when I'm acting up, when I'm acting out of accordance with my values, they've also got they're the sort of people that can turn around and call me out on it, who can hold me to account for when I'm not living into my values. You work out who those people are. That is where I would suggest you start practicing vulnerability.
Great advice. I love that. How can people connect with you and find more of your content?
So the bravestpath.com is for our consultancy, and behindbluelines.co.uk is our podcast. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're all over the social media. I would, if anyone's got any questions, the easiest way to get in touch with me is just to write to me at gareth@thebravestpath.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time, for your stories. Please leave us with a final thought from your good self.
I've always said that if I was allowed back to my old school, I would want to give a speech that probably people don't want you to give to young people or sometimes anyone. But the crux of that speech would end in: find out what is meaningful. Get in touch with your values, understand what they are, and take massive risks. I know it's not something that a lot of people will say. Go and take massive risks as long as they're aligned with your values. Be brave, be audacious. And I'll often say to people, what would you do if you were 10% braver? That's a question I will leave people with. But yeah, my final thought is if I could make a real difference, it would be to encourage people to take more risks, smart risks, in line with their values, but risks.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.